Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today to find out how you can use digital data sources to help you improve the effectiveness of your communications in market. Before we start, just a couple of quick housekeeping tips for you. So we expect today's presentation to last for about 40 minutes. If you have any questions during the webinar, please send them through using the question box that you can see below the presentation, and we'll get in touch with you after the webinar with an answer. Please also do the same if you have any issues as we are going through the webinar, and we'll come straight back to you. At the end of this presentation, we'll also be asking for your feedback. Okay, so going on with the webinar for today. So first of all, just to introduce ourselves, my name is Claire Spagarin, and I'm the Global Brand Director for In-Market Brand Guidance Solutions here at Kantar Millward Brown. That includes brand equity measurements and all types of brand and ad tracking research. And I'll be joined today by Sarah Walker, who is our dedicated global lead for digital behaviour analytics. And that's our newest solution that uses search and social data to help track the performance of campaigns and brands in market. And today we'll be focusing primarily on how it can help you measure your communications performance. So what we'll be covering today. Just in brief, we'll be talking about the importance of communications in building strong and salient brands. We'll be briefly touching on the new tools we use to measure communications impact in the post-survey world, and then we'll be focusing primarily on how we've used some of these new tools in real-life scenarios. So we'll be covering 3 real-life client case studies. And finally, we'll wrap up with some brief thoughts about how digital measurement can be incorporated into your marketing thinking. So just to start with, let's remind ourselves what's important when you're looking to build a strong, successful brand. Well, years of database learnings from having measured the success of almost 50,000 brands over 40 years of brand research at Millward Brown shows that the world's strongest brands are the ones that are meaningful, different and salient. The most meaningful brands are the ones that are particularly felt to meet people's needs either from a functional perspective or are the ones that they love and have a particular emotional attachment to. They might feel this for different reasons, but if people think a brand is meaningful to them, it will make that brand important to them. We've also established that the strongest brands tend to be the ones that are different to the competitive set. So this could be due to the fact that it offers something tangibly different, or even just a feeling or impression that the brand is in some way unique. But whatever it is, it needs to be something that clearly differentiates your brand in a positive way from its competitive set. And last but definitely not least, particularly in the context of what we're going to go on and share with you today, it's important to ensure that your brands are mentally available or salient. We know that people tend to buy the brands that are most salient, and by that I mean the ones that are most prominent for them when the need or occasion arises. So even though those basic principles are fairly clear, we definitely understand that growing equity isn't easy. So as part of our brand equity approach, we combine measures of a brand's performance on these individual components of meaning, difference and salience to create an overall summary score of a brand's equity called the power score. This is a summary measure of the estimated volume share a brand would achieve if it was just based on its equity alone. And we know that a brand's equity doesn't flip-flop overnight. This chart shows the average increase we observed in power scores for a number of brands across a database in over a 12-month period. And as you can see, the average increase is very small, just over 0.5%. And to be honest, we wouldn't really have expected to see a massive shift in underlying levels of equity. It can take years to build substantive changes. However, the good news is that the individual factors that underlie that equity do tend to move much more quickly, as you can see from this slide, which shows the average shifts we'd expect in meaning, difference and salience over the same time period. It's therefore easier for a brand to concentrate its efforts on shifting one of these levers in the shorter term, and this will ultimately impact on improving equity in the longer term. In particular, as you can see, we see that salience is the thing that often moves most easily. That's because there are many different factors that can affect a brand's salience in the short term. I'm now going to pass over to Sarah to tell you a bit more about the importance of salience and the benefits of driving it for your brand.
Thanks, Claire. We're going to be talking quite a lot about salience today. So I wanted to start by taking a couple of minutes to just talk about what we mean by salience and why it matters so much for brands in terms of what's happening in people's minds. So when we talk about a brand being salient, what we mean is that that brand is easily mentally available to people. Now, obviously, this doesn't mean they're going around thinking about the brand constantly all of the time. But what it does mean is that when they're in a relevant category purchase situation, that brand is able to come to mind quickly and easily for them. And this is really important because as a brand, you can have all of the positive associations and equity in the world. But if nothing ever triggers you to think of that brand when you're making a choice, then you're not going to buy it that often. So salience is a really vital thing for brands to have. And as Claire has said, it's one of the easiest things for brands to build in the short term. So we wanted to talk today about why that matters and why we need to do it, and how we can use digital signals to help with that. So I want to start by sharing a recent analysis of our Brand Z database. And here we looked at the projected market share of over 2,000 brands that we've tracked over a 5-year period. And we've related the change in salience that the brands have managed over that time to the corresponding change in brand share. And what we see is a clear tendency for brands that grow salience to also sell more. And what's really interesting is that this appears to hold true regardless of how much other equity that brand has. So the blue line shows the patterns for average brands, those with scores for meaningful and difference that are in line of what we'd expect for that category. But the red line on this chart shows the scores for brands that have very, very little equity otherwise. So there's not much else making them meaningful or different for brands. And even for those brands, growing salience still has a consistent positive impact on their sales share. Which isn't to say that other brands that other things don't matter. Obviously, if a brand is meaningful and different, then when it is made salient, you're even more likely to choose that brand. So if you have positive associations with it and it's become more salient, then you're even more likely to purchase it on a more regular basis than a brand that's just salient to you. And indeed, we can see here with the green line that brands that are strong on the other equity dimensions see an even more powerful impact of growing salience. On average, they grow by twice as much as brands with low equity. So salience can be a really powerful lever for any brand, regardless of how strong it is. And we're going to talk a bit about what things we can do to build salience as brand marketers. So the first and most obvious thing to talk about is that we're not always in control of how salient our brand is. So as Claire said, there are lots of different things that can impact salience in the short term. You might be featured in a news story, you might be associated with a celebrity, you might have an unfortunate product recall. But the one thing that we do know has a consistent relationship with salience that we're able to control is our communications. So we see a strong and consistent relationship between getting people to notice our communications and building salience for our brands. So one of the key ways that we're able to deliver salience growth is by creating more and better advertising for our brands. And the key thing there is more and better. So we weren't talking about the fact that there's a relationship between the amount of advertising that a brand does and salience growth, because it's more complicated than that. It's not just a case of getting your brand in front of people. That's not going to do it for you. Your advertising has to be engaging enough and impactful enough that people will notice it and that it will have a lasting impact and cause them to remember it in the future. So we know that effective communication has always been a function of the volume of communication and the quality. And this equation has actually been really important for us over the years, because if we know that that's true, and we know that we're able to measure how aware people are of your brand's communication, this lets us derive measurement of quality of advertising using surveys. So if we know how many people recall seeing your communication, and we know how much communication you were doing at that time, we're able to derive a metric that becomes an indicator of the quality of that communication in achieving impact and cutting through to people. And that's a metric that we've called the awareness index. And it's one of our oldest metrics, and if you're one of our current clients, you're probably very familiar with it. But this is a metric that we've repeatedly validated to be important, not just to driving awareness of advertising for awareness' sake, but as a really important indicator of the ability of that advertising to impact sales for the brand. So we see a consistent relationship between campaigns that achieve high awareness index scores and campaigns that drive short-term sales in market. But we're entering a world in which this kind of survey-based modelling that we've historically used and has become very important for a lot of our clients isn't really cutting it anymore. So gone are the days of being able to plan and buy campaigns 6 months in advance. We're now having to optimise campaigns much more quickly and across much more channels. And instead of being able to wait for feedback from how your previous campaign did in order to plan your next one, we're optimising as campaigns are on air, which obviously presents an issue for survey research in that it can't respond quickly enough and we can't get the sample sizes. And it's particularly important when you've got campaigns that spread across lots and lots of different executions and lots of different channels, because recruiting the samples to make sure that you get a good coverage of every part of that campaign becomes a very expensive exercise. So what's happening instead is that we're seeing lots and lots of campaigns being optimised on the data that is available to marketers. So lots of these channels are digital. They come with very short-term response metrics, engagement metrics, click-through rates. There's no shortage of data that you can use to optimise campaigns. It's just that it all tends to be focused on immediate response. And there's no real way at the moment to optimise campaigns whilst they're on air in terms of the impact that they're going to have on your brand rather than the immediate reactions to the campaign. And we think that's an issue because we think that risks having our campaigns become more and more dominated by short-termism when we know that the strength of a brand is really important in the long term. So one of the things that we as a company have been doing over the last few years is looking at whether there are new ways to measure these kind of communications impact on brands using some of these same indicators that are available digitally. So passively collected data like search patterns and web traffic and social media conversation. Can we use those to generate the same kind of indicators of quality that we could use to understand whether campaigns were impacting brands in the way that we hoped? So to talk about how we went about this, we need to go back to that definition of what mental availability is. So if we look at that definition we had earlier, which is a brand's ability to come to mind quickly and readily when activated by ideas relating to category purchase, we can see that that really breaks down into two different things. So you've got the brand's ability to come to mind at all. So how strong is the mental representation of that brand? Can you conjure anything? When you think of it, is there anything there? And how easily is the brand cued by the situation in which you might need to choose it? So it's no good having a really strong representation of the brand if when you get into the scenario when you're going to make a choice about the brand, there's nothing there that is activating that representation. So if we bear that in mind, that would suggest that if you're trying to grow mental availability, you can actually do it in two completely different ways. So the first is if you try and make your brand more famous for people. And obviously, by famous, I don't mean having its own reality TV show. But if you just make your brand more prominent in people's lives, if they see it more, they hear it more people know of it, they have more encounters with it, all of these things will add up to a stronger mental representation of your brand, which means that when you're in a scenario in which the brand might be relevant, it'll be a stronger signal to you when you're making that choice. But the other way of growing mental availability is by increasing the strength of your brand's association with the scenarios and situations in which it might be chosen. So if we associate our brand with more things and with more potential choices, we increase the likelihood of it coming to mind in more situations, which again means the brand is more likely on average to be mentally available for people. And understanding this was a really important thing for us to do when we started on this journey of trying to find non-survey correlates. Because if we have brands trying to do one of those two things, they're very, very different. And we would actually expect that to manifest into very different digital behaviours. So if we're looking at a brand that is growing fame, we would expect if a brand is being seen more and talked about more and heard more, that we would detect more presence of that brand in general conversation. So if we start looking at conversation about brands online, in social media or forums, we might reasonably expect that if a brand is becoming more famous, that the volume of that conversation might go up. Whereas if a brand is associating itself with different things, we wouldn't necessarily expect it to be talked about more, but we might expect it to be occurring more in behaviours that indicate interest. So, like searches, if you think about what's happening when someone inputs a brand name into a search box, there has to have been some need or question to which that brand was potentially going to be the answer in order for them to have searched about it. So if a brand is successfully associating itself with more needs and more scenarios and more potential use cases, it's natural to expect that we would see an increase in the number of times that that brand is searched for as a potential solution to whatever question a person has. So we set up a large R&D study where we looked at hundreds of different campaigns across lots of different categories that we had data on, and looked at which digital signals did we see responding to advertising, and did they respond in the ways that we were expecting. And I guess the nice thing for the rest of this webinar, otherwise it would be quite short, is that yes, they did. We see both brand searches and brand conversation increasing in line with a brand's media spend. So if a brand increases its media spend, then we know that that is likely to result, on average, in an increase in conversation and an increase in search, and vice versa for decreases. So we know that at least the first part of our original equation was true, that these digital indicators are impacted by the volume of your advertising. And the question becomes, are they influenced in the same way by the quality of your advertising? And therefore, can we use them to derive a measure of quality that will tell us how well a campaign is doing? And so again, the nice thing is that that does seem to be the case, particularly when we look at social conversation. So if we take all of the campaigns in our original data that we know from the survey research do either well or poorly in market, so we can split them into campaigns with a high AI or a low AI or somewhere in the middle. If we look at the efficiency of those campaigns at generating conversation about the brand, we see exactly the same pattern. So the campaigns that are good at cutting through and getting noticed and being detected by surveys are the same campaigns that generate stronger uplifts in social conversation for the same level of media spend. And that's really important, because that means that if we're able to monitor the conversation for a brand over time, and we know what level of activity the brand is doing, we're able to generate those same kind of metrics of how well did this campaign do at generating conversation, which becomes a proxy for how well we think that campaign has done at building salience for people, and therefore is likely to impact short-term sales. What's really nice about these different data sources is that if we do a similar analysis using the search data, it actually tells us something that we couldn't get before, which is that the amount of increase in brand search that you get for a given level of media spend seems to be dependent upon how compelling anything you have to say in your communication is. So if we split the ads into ads that were predominantly brand building, so ads that aim to generate kind of fame but have nothing new to say in terms of associations or building relevance to people, and compare those to ads that are specifically trying to launch or relaunch a product, which typically have lots of new news in, are always trying to build associations with new things or scenarios or use cases, we see a much, much stronger increase in search for those kind of ads for the same levels of media spend than we would for a brand building one. So we become able to start using these search metrics as not only an indicator of the creative quality and cutting through, but the creative quality in terms of building relevant associations and interest in the brand. So together, these two different data sources, if we can track and model them in almost real time, let us start being able to monitor the impact of an individual campaign on brand fame and on category relevance, but in a way that doesn't require us to wait for a survey to be done and to be modelled and be fed back. So we're able to use them to give clients weekly reads on their current performance, which is, for us, is a bit of a step change in the type of in-market measurement we're able to do. So we're very excited about the potential of these metrics. But I guess the important thing is, like any metric, they're not designed to be used in isolation. So you won't be able to tell everything from these metrics. We've been doing a lot of work to understand how to integrate them with other bits of research for our clients to create broader measurement programs, which is what Claire's going to talk a bit about in the second half of this webinar, of what new tools we're using, how we're fitting them together, and what this looks like for clients. So over to you, Claire.
So in our overall suite of brand guidance tools here at Millward Brown, we are now using a new and more advanced set of techniques to measure communication success in market. So what we do these days is we would be looking to combine the digital signals from digital behaviour analytics that Sarah has just described to us with faster turn survey-based solutions such as AdNow, which is a 24-hour turnaround in-market ad measurement solution, alongside things like cookie-based survey targeting of things like brand lift insights. And that's a tool that would use cookies to determine who's been exposed to digital comms activity so that we can quickly determine its impact on the brand. And this forms the new suite of tools that we have at our disposal that allow us to give faster and more actionable advice on in-market brand communications activity. So what we're going to do in the rest of the webinar now is focus on talking to you about some of the real examples of where we've used some of these new tools and insights from digital data in particular, and how they've helped our clients make better marketing decisions. So let's talk about some of these tools in 3 real-life client scenarios. So the first of these involves the Warburton's brand, which, for anyone who's not familiar, is a UK bakery brand, and is a real case where we use digital indicators to understand the impact of a change in their creative style. In this case, digital signals helped us establish that great creative was not only successfully able to generate engagement, but it was also able to be persuasive as well. So to give you the basic gist of the situation, Warburton's had been using a long-running campaign called Dear Jonathan, shown on the left-hand side here, with sweet, family-oriented creatives that focused on the traditional role that baked goods would play within the family. And they'd been using this campaign successfully with multiple executions over a 2-year period. So it was a successful campaign in its own right. But then in 2015, they decided to launch 2 new and slightly, should I say, wackier campaigns, which you'll hear more about in a minute, that were a dramatic change in creative direction. One was called The Deliverers and featured Sylvester Stallone as a bread delivery man, and the other was called The Giant Crumpet Show and featured the Muppets. And both of these new campaigns leverage humour, recognisable characters and well-known music, and were designed to be breakthrough communications that not only brought excitement to this category, but stood out across all categories. So to give you a flavour of the first ad, which was The Deliverers, Sylvester Stallone phones Jonathan Warburton, who's the head of the bakery, and says he wants to make a blockbuster movie about their bread. So he turns up in Bolton, which is a small northern English town for anyone who's not familiar with it, and he works with his team on a mission to deliver bread. It's spliced with all sorts of shots of training footage a la Rocky. It's got Sylvester Stallone dressed in white with his baker's hat on. He's climbing over cars, running across fields. He's driving his truck past the Bolton Hollywood sign in the bottom middle there, all to deliver this bread. And this is all accompanied by the Rocky soundtrack. And at the end of this movie-style ad, he's mobbed by his fans. So initially the question for the research was this ad actually the breakthrough that it was designed to be? Well, using signals from digital behaviour analytics, we were able to establish that the new campaign had indeed had a strong impact on social mentions on the left-hand side here, quite a significant increase. And this indicated that the brand was growing fame as desired. In fact, it was 2.5 times more efficient at generating social buzz for the brand compared to the 2014 averages we'd observed, and actually 5 times more efficient compared to 2013. There was little impact on search, but this was as expected because this first execution was not really designed to boost relevant associations, more just to really build strong engagement with the brand, which it did succeed in doing. However, the brand team then had a new product launch coming up as well, and the question now was, could they use this new groundbreaking blockbuster creative style to get across their new product message, or would that new product message get completely lost in all the drama? So if we move on to look at the next ad, which was the Muppets ad called The Giant Crumpet Show, if you try to imagine a vast Muppet sing-along extravaganza featuring the entire cast of the Muppets, exactly like one of their TV shows or movies. All the action is set in a crumpet factory with Kermit and Miss Piggy, a Fozzie Bear and the entire gang all singing about Warburton's new giant crumpets, which is the product news. There's lots of jokes, there's comedy analysis of the size of the crumpet in the bottom middle there, and there's even a breaking news story about the giant crumpet brokering world peace. So amid all of that content and action, did the new product message actually come across? Well, again, let's have a look at the results from our digital behaviour analytics. The big reveal is that on the left-hand side, the third column, this new campaign also performed extremely well in terms of generating fame, even better than the deliverers. So it was successfully continuing the momentum built by that initial execution. But this time it also did really well on search on the right-hand side. And this indicated that it was indeed building relevant interest in the brand as a result of that new product message. So these digital measures, as Sarah said, can be accessed weekly and allowed us to provide a quick way to indicate if a campaign is working well or not at an overall level and on which mechanisms it's actually driving the brand. But in order to understand more about the performance of these ads, we then went on to conduct a creative assessment via AdNow, which is a quick turn survey. And as you can see, it allowed us to diagnose the executional performance, and these executions performed incredibly well on all our key measures of both engagement and persuasion, which is what we'd seen indicated by the earlier digital behaviour analytics read. And then a few months later, we were able to see the impact on the brand itself, either through tracking or in this case through actual shifts in sales. So they did see a positive impact on the brand as a result of this campaign. So digital signals quickly allow us to understand the performance of our campaign within a week of airing. And in this case, the assessment that it looked like a great success was a point of view shared by the company chairman, Jonathan Warburton himself. I mean, he basically went on to say the impact of this campaign has far surpassed our expectations. So they felt it was a great ad. And from our point of view, it also makes a great example of how brands are able to use digital signals as part of their broader measurement framework to understand communications. And now back to Sarah.
So the second case study that we want to talk about is very, very different. So that first example was obviously very focused on a big brand's TV campaign and the impact that that had when it launched. But I wanted to include an example of where we've used those same digital signals to expressly look at the impact of a campaign beyond the core TV creative. So this second case study involves a beverages brand in the UK who used digital indicators to measure the quality and efficiency of their whole media mix and use these to make creative optimization decisions as they went along. So to give you a bit of background, we had a brand who were launching a new variant, and they're a very established brand. They have a very well-loved and long-running creative device in their advertising that they were keen to continue using. And they created the next TV execution that was similar in style to their past work, but that launched these new products. And the new TV campaign, they pre-tested before it went on air, and it tested extremely well. So it did very well, not just on impact and engagement, but also on persuasion and making the brand seem different, which are exactly the kind of things we would expect a good launch ad to do. But when they put it on air, we were able to see from the reaction, or lack of reaction, of the search and the social signals that the actual overall impact of the campaign was at best mediocre. It didn't create any meaningful uplift over what they typically saw, and it was certainly doing nothing to drive category relevance, which is what we'd expect for a new product launch. And given the quality of the TV campaign, they were slightly confused as to why it wasn't doing better. So it prompted them to take a look at the rest of the media in their mix. And this TV campaign had been previously on air with predominantly print and digital support, which they hadn't pre-tested, but they kind of assumed would be okay. And when they actually looked at it, it became evident that the creative in the other channels lacked the humour and warmth of the TV ad, so it wasn't really that engaging for people. But it also tried to perhaps cram too many messages into each execution. So there were multiple new variants mentioned in each digital ad, in each print ad, which starts to impair the creative's ability to get any message across. So when they put this ad on air for a second time, they completely redid the supporting media. So they did new digital activity, they replaced the print with new outdoor activity, each of which just focused on one new variant and included a much stronger call to action in a free sample offer for the product. And what we see then is a market uplift, even by eye, at the impact of that campaign on the amount of search and social being driven by the advertising. So it was much more engaging, it was much better at building relevant interest, and it performed overall much better for the brand. And I think getting this kind of data mid-campaign and between different bursts can be really important in helping clients swap out underperforming executions before they waste future media spend on them. Because if we're just relying on our pre-testing results, most of the time we don't pre-test every element of the campaign. So if we know that the campaign should have been good, we're going to assume that overall it's performing well. And this kind of thing gives a very cheap and easy way of getting some feedback that suggests maybe you need to relook at something, or in some cases confirms that everything's working as you expected. So it can be a really useful in-market decision tool. And the final case study we wanted to talk about is different again. So it sticks with the theme of using digital signals to optimise media strategy, but this time over a much longer period and in a very specific scenario. So here we've got a brand who are looking to try and use alternative channels to compensate for a decrease in their TV spend. And to give you some background, our client had their marketing budgets cut for the next year to the point where they felt it was no longer feasible to do any TV advertising at all. And it would be better to invest the money that they did have in alternative channels and try and compensate for the lack of TV that way. Now, prior to this, they'd always been big spenders on TV and had had some very successful campaigns. So whilst they knew this had helped them build a strong brand, they were understandably worried about the impact of being off-air for a significant period on their brand's equity. And we know from our data that there are big risks associated with brands going dark on TV. So we can see here the average change in survey measures 6 months after a brand stops spending on TV. And you start to see quite significant decreases in quite a lot of them. So obviously the biggest impact is seen in people being aware of your brand's communications, which is what's indicated here as TBCA, is Total Brand Communications Awareness. That's to be expected. If we do less advertising, people will think we do less advertising. But the one that's more concerning is the decrease in the mentions of the brand in a survey, because this is a really key indicator of a brand's salience declining. And we know that after 6 months of not being on air, we would typically expect to see quite a big impact on a brand's salience, which is not what we want here. So that's not to say that you can't compensate for being off air, and particularly in today's media where there are many, many different channels in which you can deliver compelling creative, it's certainly possible to compensate for it, but it's a very difficult thing to do. And moreover, it's very difficult to understand whether you're doing it successfully or not if you're having to wait 6 months for that trickle-down effect to be seen in surveys, because often 6 months in is too late because the damage has already been done. So what we wanted to know here was, if we started using these same digital signals, but looking at them in a slightly different way, so looking at the trends in these signals, ignoring the short-term wobbliness and the random spikes that are caused by different news stories occurring, if we looked at the general trend in these signals, does this start to tell us something about how well the brand's salience is holding up after the point that they've gone off air? And I guess the answer is yes, it does. And what it told us fairly early on was not a particularly positive story for the brand. So pretty much as soon as the brand went off air, we started seeing a decrease in the amount of searches for the brand, the amount it cropped up in general conversation, which certainly started to indicate that the brand's salience was falling. So in this instance, the digital signals, because they're available very quickly, were able to act as an early warning system for the brand and tell them that maybe what they were hoping would happen with this supporting activity wasn't succeeding as much as they would hope, so maybe they need to look into whether they could do something different, which is exactly what we did. So we started looking at whether there was something about the activity they were doing in these different channels that just maybe wasn't that good. So was it the case that the quality of the creative they put out was just not really good enough to engage people, so no one was watching it, and so it wasn't having any impact? So we looked at some creative diagnostics on the executions where we showed it to people in a survey and measured it as we would a normal piece of TV advertising. And actually what we see here is that the creative diagnostics for the different executions were excellent. So they scored above average on likability, they scored well on branding and relevance. There's nothing in these creative and people's reaction to them that would suggest that they wouldn't be working. So we were trying to work out what was happening. We've really got two options. And one of them is that people were enjoying watching the creative, but there was something stopping that creative from having any lasting impact on their brand perceptions. So they were enjoying the moment, but it wasn't translating to equity or salience for the brand. Or they were working and people were enjoying them and they were impacting brand opinions, but they just weren't reaching enough people to have an impact on the overall trend. And it is important for the client to understand which of these things was going on, because the implication of what you would do is very different. If there's a problem with the creative, then obviously you look at starting to try and do different executions or different types of advertising. Whereas if it's just an issue with the media and how many people you're reaching, then maybe you start looking at how to spend your budget differently. So what we were able to do was recommend to them that on the next execution that they ran, we used one of those new tools that Claire talked about earlier called Brand Lift Insights, which lets us use cookie-based targeting to get around the problem that in a normal sample, if we're trying to look at individual people that have been exposed to specific pieces of creative, there won't be that many of them. And what Brand Lift Insights does is let us use people's individual level cookie data about where they've been on the websites, which ads they've been exposed to, what they've clicked on, to isolate a group of people that we know have been exposed to that execution, and a matched control group who are similar in demographics and profile and internet activity that we know haven't been exposed to it. And it lets us target those two groups specifically with a little brand survey that then lets us measure their attitude to the brand, and by comparing the two groups, identify whether exposure to that piece of creative has had any impact on what they think about the brand or how they feel towards it. So we set this up for the next execution. And what we saw was a bit disappointing, was that actually if we looked overall across the whole sample of people that were exposed to the ads, there was no impact on their brand favourability or affinity or how likely they say they were to purchase that brand at all compared to the people that hadn't seen that piece of creative, which would suggest that it wasn't really working at all, which is disappointing. But it also is only half the story, because when you dig into the results a bit more, what we see is that actually there's nothing wrong with the creative's ability to impact people, but it just takes more than one exposure to it for it to have any impact. So if we split out those same results by people that just saw the piece of creative once versus people that saw it 2 or 3 plus times, we see that when you've seen it multiple times, the ad has had much more ability and chance to impact your brand perceptions, and we do start to see a strong impact over the control group. And this makes sense if you think about how advertising works. It would have to be a very, very strong piece of creative for one view to suddenly impact your overall attitudes and opinions that you've had for years. But in terms of how the client was thinking they needed to spend their media budget to make up for not being on TV, I think there was a temptation to try and reach as many people as you possibly could, at the detriment perhaps of that frequency of exposure. So the client was able to, next time, understand that the reason the campaign wasn't working wasn't because there's anything wrong with the campaign, but just that they weren't currently reaching enough people with enough frequency for it to be allowed to impact. So for future campaigns, they know that they will be better off targeting fewer people with a higher frequency, which would let them generate a much stronger brand impact using the same creative and for the same budget. So they would be better able to support their brand in those periods where it's off air if they give their creative more chance to impact the people that see it.
Okay, so thank you, Sarah. So finally, just to wrap up, we hope we've been able to demonstrate with these real examples that we've just shown you how digital data sources and new tracking techniques can be used to help prove the value of great creative work, to understand the importance of the complete media mix, and even to help support brands during periods of financial pressure. If you want to know any more about ways it might be able to help you, please do reach out to your local client team or to one of us for more information. And before we close today, don't forget to submit any outstanding questions you have via the system, and please do leave us your feedback. So thanks again for joining us, and goodbye for now.